big thing. And if you look right up front in the water code, there are some sections starting with number 100 that actually lay out what the state legislature thinks about ownership of water and water rights. So what I thought I'd do today, so you leave with something useful, is tell you about a few of those sections and what they say about ownership. So first of all, you have Water Code Section 102 that says that water is owned by the people of the state. I don't know how helpful it is, but that's what it says right there. Water Code Section 104 says that while the water is controlled by the people of the state, it's the state itself that gets to determine how to allocate usage or convert it to public use and that kind of thing. And then some of you might be familiar with the 106 and 106.5. 106 of the Water Code is the provision that says domestic use comes first and irrigation comes second. And then it doesn't tell you what comes third, fourth, and fifth, but at least we got the top two there for you. 106.5 expresses a preference for municipal water rights, and it says that municipal water rights should be protected to the fullest extent necessary for existing and future uses. We've had a few court cases about what that might mean, but nothing, I don't think, exhaustively definitive on that. But some cities will take a hard look at that. And then there's a provision in there, Section 107, that all these declarations of policy out there are to be, what it says exactly is they shall be given their full force and effect. So that is an expression by the legislature that even though these are declarations of policy up front in the Water Code, they really have meaning and they should have some teeth in them. And lawyers get to spend their lifetimes arguing, at least in the water industry, about what full force and effect means and how clearly we should enforce those. And then finally, I wanted to read from you a sentence from the Supreme Court case, the California Supreme Court from 1957, that explained this. The state as an entity is the holder of the legal title as trustee for the benefit of the people of the state of water, all of whom in the last analysis are the water users of the state. So that's what our California Supreme Court said about that. And what's interesting to me is even back in 1957, we had a split on the Supreme Court. There was a 4-3 split on that decision. So the four justices said what I just told you, and 3 of them said, hey, wait a minute, this whole concept of imbuing the trust or a trust into water law is just going to create all sorts of confusion. But I can tell you as a water lawyer that we're really happy there's this confusion because that's what keeps them in Jessica. Very, very busy. So,
okay, we're going to talk about some state level updates, and we're going to start by putting up section 106.3 on the screen because a lot of what is happening recently at least refers in some way to this concept, even if it doesn't directly cite this section. So it's a policy statement. It declares that the established policy of the state is that every human being has the right to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water adequate for human consumption, cooking, and sanitary purposes. It directs the state and state agencies to consider this policy when it makes certain decisions. It protects the state from legal liability if it fails to provide water to anybody. And it's got a couple of carve-out provisions at the end. These are the types of provisions that, as Steve just mentioned, lawyers love to argue over. And we might see some arguing over these two in the future. So some quick legislative and recent happenings. Budget acts, $10 million each for emergency drinking water projects and local water district assistance. And then we had SB 988, SB 200 first. This was mentioned in our opening presentation this morning. This was the one that the initial idea was to tax water delivery. There was a lot of pushback on that concept, so instead, this new fund will pull from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. There's also, I think, up to $20 million annually from the general fund, so total up to $150 million annually eventually. And we have, so if we go back quickly, so when I say there's room for argument over the last 2 bullet point provisions, this might be one of them. SB 998, it doesn't mean that residential water suppliers can never shut off water service for failure to pay. but it does impose new requirements, and it does prohibit discontinuation of service in certain circumstances. For example, if the customer can show financial hardship that meets the provisions of the statute. Sativa Water District, you might have heard about this one. It got a lot of press last year. This is a district, it covers Compton and Woodbridge in the Los Angeles area. It's got about 1,600 connections. There are a lot of complaints about water that wasn't drinkable. There are some allegations of financial mismanagement. The legislature did pass a bill that allowed the State Water Board to essentially dissolve Sativa Water District, and the board did so late last year. I don't think this is the type of thing we'll see too often when it comes to other water systems that have trouble providing supplies. I think a lot of the time what we see there, especially with much smaller ones where there's maybe a couple dozen connections, not 1,600, is it's economies of scale. They really just need more funding sources to supply their customers. Here there's a lot more going on, including the complaints that there was some financial mismanagement. For now, the County of Los Angeles is covering this territory. I believe that the end goal is for it to be rolled into another existing district. Very recently, Senator Harris proposed a bill that would provide $220 billion for safe drinking water projects. The Flint, Michigan case is a big driver of this one. There's a question mark there because I don't think it is exceptionally skeptical to wonder if the Republican-controlled Senate will allow a Democratic candidate for president to get a bill like this moving anywhere, anytime soon. And then finally, the State Water Board does have a portal. It is mostly informational. The information that might be most interesting to water suppliers is funding information. There are some Prop 1 funds, and other than that, there's not too much on that site yet, but it does kind of let you see where we're going. We have a panel at this conference about these topics. Unfortunately, it's happening now, but if you want a slightly more detailed and perhaps more of the actual water supplier side, I would encourage you to talk to those panelists maybe during the break or after the conference today. So these are related. We had AB 1668 last year. This is the bill that will set indoor water use efficiency standards, starting at 55 gallons per person per day and then ramping down to 50 gallons per person per day. It also has some requirements regarding agricultural water use information. Relatedly, SB 606 also has some urban water use objectives and a funding penalty. So if your urban water management plan is not in compliance with the law, there will be a bar on state grants and loans. And then SB 555, this one is really about system leaks. It's a little older, so leaky pipes. This is one of the things that I believe they're talking about next door right now. The main thing to know is that there is a rulemaking process going on now. I didn't put the website up there, but if you Google SWRCD water loss control, you should be able to get to the website. A couple of SGMA updates. We've been through several rounds, well, DWR, Department of Water Resources, have been through several rounds of basin prioritization to determine where certain basins fall into the SGMA scheme. The final one should be coming out any week. DWR has also recently made determinations regarding alternatives to the basic SGMA plan concept. So these are either areas that have existing plans that have been in place or areas that are attempting to demonstrate that they can be sustainable for a 10-year period. DWR approved 9 of them, and 6 of them were not recommended for approval, which is a very nice way of saying rejected. None of those are in this area. I think the closest geographically is the Ojai Valley Basin. The rest of them are really in the Central Valley or even a little farther. One of them is in Lake. Our first triggers for the state backstop. The state backstop is essentially a provision that allows the State Water Board to step in to manage groundwater if a groundwater sustainability agency is not formed in an area that needs one, or if the groundwater management plan that is proposed by a groundwater sustainability agency does not pass muster. And then finally, I wanted to say we're going to talk a little bit about some pending legislation regarding temporary permits for underground storage. But one thing that is related to that is we know we've got a lot of storage space underground. We've got more underground than we have available on the surface right now. We know that sometimes there's a whole lot of surface water, more than we can need and more than we can store in our surface water reservoirs. So the temptation is very obviously, and I think encouraged to some extent, to take those high flows, whether it's flood flows or it's just really high flows that maybe don't reach flood level, siphon off some of those and use them for recharge projects so that we can improve some of our groundwater basins. We like those types of projects. I just want to make sure that everyone is aware that we still do have environmental considerations when we are permitting these types of projects, we being a state board. And if the state board forgets these environmental concerns, the Department of Fish and Wildlife will remind us through the protest process. So essentially, we can have a high flow, we can have a flood flow, but we still need to have some sort of protection of the natural hydrograph. We don't want to cut it off and have a completely straight line. We still want some heat flows, we want some flushing flows, we want some gravel to be moved around, we want woody debris to be moved around. So when you come to the state board or any other agency with projects that involve taking high flows or flood flows or peak flows or whatever you would like to call them, it will be helpful if you have thought in advance of how you will help protect that natural hydrograph. CDFW has been doing a lot of this in our permitting process recently. There are a couple ways to do it. You can do things like just take a certain percentage of what is considered a flood flow, but we are not in a situation where we are going to be allowed to just take everything that can be called a flood flow and put it in the ground. This is an ongoing process. There will be an opportunity for public comment later this year. That graph is from one of the presentations that our enforcement folks put on a little earlier this year. Something flipped in 2014 in the recent drought that was not flipped in the same sense in the drought of the early aughts and the one around the turn of the decade. We got many more water rights complaints. A big part of developing this enforcement policy is to create a prioritization system so that when we get the next drought, which certainly will happen at some point, we're focusing on, hopefully, bigger picture, more crucial complaints rather than maybe dealing with smaller ones, smaller amounts of water, less considerable problems, just because we have so many of them that we can't do anything but take them in order. There's also, last year, created a new Office of Administrative Hearings, ACL complaints or administrative liability complaints. CDOs are cease and desist orders, and I think revocations are pretty straightforward. 2 points here. One, a little more separation of functions between the water rights side and the enforcement side. And 2, hopefully freeing up staff on the water rights side so that we can deal more with water rights and less with some of the enforcement issues. And finally, a couple more legislative updates. AB 658 would create a process for 5-year temporary permits or changes involving underground storage. This one has not seen much opposition at all. It looks like it will go. And I don't know if the governor has a position on it yet, but something like this has been in the works for a couple of years. This is the farthest I think any proposal has actually gotten. And we might actually see this one go through. So again, for these types of projects, just keep in mind if you bring application or a change petition to the state board, that protection of the natural hydrograph is something that we're going to be looking at. SB1 you might have heard of. This is, put anti-rollback on the slide. It's an anti-Trump administration bill. The idea is that if the Trump administration rolls back federal protections, the state protections would snap into place and maintain the same level. There is some opposition to this one, and I think some people have questions regarding whether it would work as intended, so this one may not, it's a little less of a certainty. SB 19, this would have the state put in stream gauges where we currently do not have any. I think a problem with this one now is that there's no funding currently available. It's been put on suspense. I think if we see this one go, it will go next year, maybe not this year. And then finally, to hand it off to Jessica, Governor Newsom signed SB 307 on July 31st. And the title of the bill references conveyance facilities, but it is really a bill about Cadiz. And with that, I will hand it off.
Thank you. Perfect queued up segue. So for those who might have come in late, I apologize to anyone who is. Sorry.
Talk amongst yourselves.
Okay.
We'll see if
Oh,
we can figure this out.
I'll introduce myself. I think it.
There are two loaded up at the moment.
There are only two loaded up, and that's the last of the slides, I think. Yeah. Do you see one there, Jessica, that looks like yours?
Are we 2A? Or sorry, 1.
1A. There's the panel. Let's see what I have no idea what this is.
Well, I don't want to hold us up. I can start. I don't know if we can grab Nicole. She might be able to.
Yep. I'll go try to find Nicole.
Awesome, thank you. But I was planning on just ripping anyway, but I mostly just wanted folks to have the benefit of the hydro cartoons for
We'll be right back.
my description of the Cadiz project. So in any event, I apologize for anyone who is hoping to see Scott Slater. He's the CEO of Cadiz Incorporated. He could not make it due to a scheduling conflict. So when they asked me to stand in for Scott and said, he was going to say a few words about Cadiz, I thought, well, I don't want to talk about a water development project in the middle of the Mojave Desert to a bunch of builders and urban water suppliers. But then I thought, and in particular listening to some of the comments this morning, there are actually a lot more points of nexus than meet the eye. So I think the first was brought up in the introductory remarks, that for all of you builders out there, there are many reasons for folks to oppose development projects, but one that we all want to be able to take off the table is water. And a massive new water supply project is one way to do that. Brings me to a connection to what Steve and Amanda have discussed. So, Steve and Amanda talked about all of these very aggressive efforts that we've made in California to control demand. So if you're on the urban water supplier side, you're facing conservation mandates, you're facing requirements about reducing your conveyance losses, and requirements as to rolling out metering, or perhaps you're investing money in advanced metering infrastructure to improve your customers' efficiencies. If you're a home builder, as was mentioned this morning, you've already seen extraordinary increases in the efficiency standards for residential development. You might be facing pressures to voluntarily adopt higher green building standards to get your projects through the political process, or perhaps local ordinances that require even more stringent water efficiency regulations. But at a certain point, there's only so much you can do through demand management, right? A big part of the puzzle is supply. And as builders, you may not directly have control over that, but I think the discussion over water supply holds some important lessons for how the politics work and how you can guide the narrative to help balance the dynamic between the perception of water as a public resource and a public right, as we've talked about, and also something that is imbued with a very strong element of private property interest. Sorry, is it? It's not on there.
It's not on the computer.
Okay, that's
Sorry.
okay. I will describe the, so I think Cadiz has a booth in the lobby, so you can see all the pretty pictures afterwards, but I'll do my best to just paint a mental picture of the project for you. So I wanted to get a show of hands. How many people have heard of the Cadiz project? Okay. And to kind of test people's knowledge apropos to the anecdote about folks who say they know where the Bay Delta is, how many people think you could describe the general parameters of the project at a cocktail party? Okay, great. That's super helpful. Well, I apologize I don't have the pictures for you. But so Cadiz Inc. owns over 30,000 acres in the eastern Mojave. 9,600 of those acres are irrigated. There's been agriculture there since the 1980s, organic raisins and citrus. And recently, Cadiz just entered into an exciting partnership to have one of the largest legal commercial hemp operations in California. And it's actually a really great fit for the desert because, as you may know, hemp is a very low water use crop. And there's actually history of hemp cultivation in the Cadiz Valley with some of these deeds from the early 1900s actually referencing hemp as an approved crop. And if you've flown out of the Ontario airport and you're looking to your east, you might have seen these green parcels, and that's Cadiz's property. So that's the history. Now, in terms of the geography, Cadiz is situated in a watershed that's 1,300 square miles. So it's about, not to get into any friendly competition, but it's about 5 to 6 times the size of the Chino Basin. And it's also approximately the size of Rhode Island. So this is a huge geographic area and with extremely diverse topography. In that watershed, you have the highest point in the Mojave Desert at 7,200 feet elevation. So with that elevation, you get snowfall and precipitation that comes down the mountains, and that water slowly makes its way down gradient into the aquifer, where it eventually flows into this 2 to 3 mile area called the Fenner Gap. So it's a constriction in the aquifer. And from there, in a lot of places, of course, you'd have groundwater that would exit either to the ocean eventually or to a surface water body. So the neat thing about the hydrology in the Cadiz area is that the water actually exits to these dry lakes called Bristol and Cadiz dry lakes, where 30,000 acre-feet per year evaporates. That is the key piece of, I know it came up earlier, the need to focus on the science. The key piece of the hydrology that Cadiz looked at and thought, here's an opportunity to intervene, and what's basically a natural pump, pumping 30,000 acre-feet out of the aquifer to waste, to evaporation. There's an opportunity to intervene, to pump that water, and put it to beneficial use. So in essence, the Cadiz project, for a period of 50 years, it would, intercept the water. So it would construct a series of well fields to intercept the water before it goes into the Fenner Gap and is lost to evaporation. And then also the drawdown portion would pump an amount slightly higher than the annual recharge, around 30,000 acre-feet per year, to reverse the hydraulic gradient and actually claw back some of the molecules that are between the Fenner Gap and these dry lakes that would otherwise be lost to high salinity water and evaporation. So then from there, the part of the project is the construction of a 43-mile pipeline from Cadiz to tie into the Colorado River Aqueduct in Rice. One interesting thing is part of the project's philosophy is to really lean in to environmental stewardship, which I think is also kind of in keeping with some of the introductory remarks, right? We can't fight the fact that this is a state with some of the most stringent environmental regulations and certainly some of the trickiest environmental politics. And frankly, we probably owe to that a lot of our quality of life. But it also can create quite a challenge for development, whether it's residential development or a water project. And so one of the things the project did is to align the new pipeline along an existing railroad right-of-way. So it's the Arizona-California right-of-way. It goes from the Cadiz property to Rice, where it can tie into the California River Aqueduct. The motivation behind that was to avoid any impacts to the desert tortoise. And Cadiz has been a huge supporter of desert tortoise habitat. In conjunction with the state of California, they developed the largest desert tortoise conservation bank in the state's history, over 7,000 acres. So that's an exciting piece of the project that would allow the water then to flow throughout California, delivered through the Colorado River Aqueduct to water suppliers throughout Southern California. So the primary private partner in the enterprise is the Santa Margarita Water District, which of course serves Orange County. So they were the lead agency for CEQA purposes in developing the project, and they will supervise the project's construction and operations. There are also a number of other public water suppliers, Golden State, Cal Water, Harupa, Three Valleys, that have signed letters of intent and are also project participants. 50,000 acre-feet per year of water, looking at the ability to serve approximately 400,000 residents. So this is a huge dent in California's systemic water supply needs. So I'll end my infomercial portion of my remarks, but I wanted to just lay that framework because regardless of where you stand on the project, it is a really unique hydrology and unique opportunity, and I think the tie-in to residential development is the need to convey to the public what the science actually is and what the impacts actually are, right? So a lot of, if you're a developer and you're doing new residential, that construction is going to be a lot more efficient than existing construction. You might be helping contribute to affordable housing or replace some of the housing stock lost in the wildfires or move our land use patterns towards more sustainable practices. If you can't throw money at your project by offering to pay for water credits or upgrade existing housing, you at least can change the narrative to change the politics. Just a brief piece on the water rights, and then I'll stop filibustering. The interplay, it certainly is a matter of law. Us lawyers love to talk about kind of this tension between water as a public resource and what really is a well recognized in the case law as a real property interest and the right to use water. But it's also, I think, in the eyes of the public, a really significant hurdle. There's this huge legal framework, and I think public understanding that we share water resources, and any attempt at water development is often seen as privatization. And even I think on the developer side, that's something that can be hard to overcome when people see any new development is kind of a water guzzler rather than just a community amenity. So we can get a little bit more into that. But I think that is really the challenge, whether you're a water developer or the builder.
Do you have something you want to add to it?
Well, I think the only thing I would add was you saw the legislation that we put up and discussed, and Amanda discussed, and what we're talking about here with Jessica, is that the commonality with all that is not just this is about water. The pessimists would say that this is representation of legislation that's the loss of local control. It's state dictating how local water agencies will pursue their policies. It's when you can terminate water service. There's always been a floor for that, but the bar has been raised. It's how much water you can serve to customers without penalizing them. It's who can control what. And what we see, at least from my side of the equation here representing public water agencies, is the discretion given to you and your board members is constricting over time. And that's something that probably, or most definitely, affects you in the BIA as well, and you building industry folks. Because when you go to the water agencies at your local land jurisdictions and say, hey, could you be a little bit more flexible with me or with my project, we can do this. We want to do that for you, at least the boards that I represent, the water agencies, but you have to recognize that we're controlled in large respects by the state, and that control is becoming more and more rigid.
So if we follow along with that and say, is there really a trend here? Is this an isolated incident where other tactics to control what Cadiz was up to didn't work, or you were working right through them, then we're going to reach over the top legislatively? If you look at what's currently happening on our legislative level with local control over zoning, land use, and so on, when the governor decides we're going to build so many units, how does that impact local ability to set zoning and density and so on? And the inference here is, if you don't figure out how to make those RENA numbers, we're going to reach over the top of you from the state level and strip out, or at least amend, your ability to do land use planning and tell you how it's going to happen. And I see these two as related. They're not running in tandem, but it's a trend that frightens me as a planning commissioner and as a developer about what's happening. So is this really a trend, or are these just two little isolated incidents that really don't have anything to do with where we're going as a state? Oh, come on.
I mean, I have a strong opinion.
You all get a shot at it, and then we're going to ask for some questions, and I think this is probably where we center our attention, is this a sea change in who controls the water and the decisions we get to make, and if we make local decisions that somebody doesn't like, are we going to have legislation that comes over the top of us and takes that right away? I don't think anybody other than Sacramento is in favor of that, but is that what's going on?
Absolutely. I mean, so I didn't touch on SB 307, but it was just signed into law by the governor. And it is, I don't know if it's part of a larger trend, but it certainly set a very troubling precedent. So by way of background, there are a series of provisions in the California Water Code that were enacted to allow agencies or private entities to do what's called wheel water, or use another entity's water conveyance infrastructure to get water from one place to another for reasons of efficiency and maximizing beneficial use. And there was an initial legislative attempt that failed 2 years ago to enact a provision that literally laid out the geographic boundaries of the Cadiz project in the legislation and said, if you are pumping water from the aquifer underlying these desert lands is so defined, and wheeling them, then notwithstanding everything we said in sections 1810 through 1814 of the Water Wheeling Act, you have to undergo this entirely distinct, separate, and additional environmental review with the State Lands Commission and California Department of Fish and Game. Now, to be clear, the Cadiz project has been through numerous levels of environmental review, including CEQA, 9 lawsuits, 6 successful trial court determinations, all upheld in the Court of Appeal. So there's not a concern about the science and the technology, but to the point about the concern of kind of doing an end run through state legislative fiat if no other avenue is successful to stop a project, I think is very troubling.
So it had your geographic boundaries, but it had a completely different name. So nobody really knew what it was.
Well, everyone knew what it was. I mean, I think that's what animated the support. Yeah, I mean, it was transparent. And if you look at the committee bill reports, they all say this project has to do with the Cadiz project.
I want to ask Amanda, is this a trend? Are we seeing a usurpation or a shift of authority, or it's always been that we just didn't recognize it?
I think when it comes to groundwater, the Cadiz legislation is a bit of an outlier. I think at the very general level, right now the state is waiting to see how SGMA works. There are triggers for state backstops, but what we're not seeing is a big push to do more at the general level than what SGMA currently does. I don't think there's any push to move to a groundwater permitting system along the lines of what Nevada has. But at the same time, that can be small comfort when it's apparent that if a project becomes a target for any reason and it's got enough support, there can be a special bill that attacks just that project.
Steve, you have an opinion on this trend?
There's always been state legislation and there's always been focus, but when you think back to the drought and all of you bigger water suppliers had to prepare those monthly reports about how much water you were using and whether you hit your 28% or your 32% target, and there were a few outliers out there who didn't come close to meeting those targets, I don't want to say for sure, but it looks like that precipitated some of this legislation. Some of the folks that were sort of outside the boundaries and not complying with the state mandates that were there, and certainly that state mandate was something important to put into place, but the folks who didn't comply with that might have led some of the state legislators to say, well, we better put our hands on this and grasp a little firmer. I mean, one positive note here is that there was a reference made to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, the relatively new groundwater law. The good news for the BIA in San Bernardino County is that you had forward thinkers in the western part of this county, in the high desert, years ago went through adjudication processes. And because you did that, and as hard as it is to manage those basins, I'm involved in a couple of those, it is such a grand gesture that happened, and it might not have been for the reasons of avoiding SGMA because it happened so long ago, but the very fact that you have those judgments in place and the water rights have been allocated really puts this county on much firmer ground overlying all those basins than a lot of these other areas and water districts who I'm also working for, where they're facing this allocation for the first time. So if you want to get up and cheer, you might want to cheer your water leaders from back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that went forward, spent 10 years in court, adjudicated the Chino Basin, Mojave, and a bunch of the other basins around you, because that really puts you a step ahead in the water business here. So you can pat yourselves on the back, or the people who came before you. So that's the good news on the SGMA side for at least San Bernardino County.
May I just add quickly to the county kudos?
Wait, if you get a cheer, you got to wait like 5 more minutes.
And one thing I was remiss in not mentioning is so Steve mentioned the adjudicated areas, but in the non-adjudicated areas, the county really deserves a ton of credit for having the foresight way before they were under the threat of SGMA. Back in 2002, they adopted the Desert Groundwater Management Ordinance, and that was this incredibly proactive regime for protecting the types of resources in the area that the Cadiz project is in. So it actually requires a county permit unless there's a process, which is what the Cadiz project went through, where the county adopts a groundwater management plan. And in the case of Cadiz, it's extremely detailed with aggressive monitoring and benchmarks, and actually county jurisdiction to halt the project if drawdown gets too far. And then also a memorandum of understanding with Santa Margarita Water District and Cadiz Inc. to make sure that plan is enforceable. It's really a pretty extraordinary pre-SGMA effort on the part of the county.
Any other comments? We're going to take a couple questions. We're almost up. Okay, so do we have any questions for the panel? You've got a shot at some.
How do they plan on monitoring?
Stand up and give it and real loud.
In the Walnut Valley Water District, how are they planning on monitoring the 55 gallons of water per day for irrigation?
I believe it will be done through.
Amanda, repeat the question.
The question is how, if I understand right, how will we be monitoring the 55 gallon per person per day standard, which will eventually drop to 50? I believe it is mostly going to be on self-reporting. The standard applies at the supplier level, not the individual household level. So in other words, individual households don't have to certify or report anything about their water use. It will be done at the district level, which may be an effort to build in some flexibility. So if you've got some older homes that aren't as efficient, you can maybe make up some of that average by building more efficient homes, which are, the efficiency the basic efficiency of new homes that are built is getting better and better all the time. And so I think the hope is that the standards will not be too difficult to meet as we just bring in this new technology.
Luis Centino, Vice President of the Board of Cucamonga Valley Water District. I'd like to ask you a question along the lines of AB 1668. How can I honestly tell my ratepayers that they have to adhere to 55 gallons per day when they all have meters? If this is statewide, and there are numerous agencies in the north whose ratepayers don't have meters.
That is a accurate observation, I think, and kind of tying back to some of the conversation that we just had. I think a lot of the time in the south part of the state, because the water supply issue sometimes stares you in the face much more closely than it does in the north part, we've got more metering, we've got already more consideration to water use efficiency than we sometimes have in northern parts of the state where it tends to be rainy, and we don't have river systems that are as flashy as they can be down here. So it's rarer, it can happen, but it's rarer to see a dewatered stream or river in the north. As far as how you explain this to your customers, northern water suppliers are going to be held to the standard and they will have to face the consequences of not complying. I think if you guys aren't close to being there already, you'll get there soon, and that should be something that you can congratulate yourselves on. I think you can be proud of water efficiency that exceeds what is being accomplished at the current moment in other parts of the state.
We have one more, sir.
You were mentioning SB1, and I was wondering why you call it something related to Trump, and also what's the general support behind
The question is why I mentioned SB1 as being related to Trump and where the support for that one is coming from. I think a lot of the support is coming from the environmental entities, environmental community. It does also address OSHA standards as well, so there's a little bit of workplace concern there too. It is in some respects an anti-Trump bill because it is designed to prevent the harm that some people think will occur if the federal administration rolls back any environmental protections, whether they go to water or I think endangered species. And again, there's one provision that relates to OSHA standards as well. So it's really the state of California, this has been kind of a trend over the last few years, to some extent going its own way because it doesn't line up ideologically with the federal administration.
All right, one more.
I'm going to go ahead and do it, and I'll try to put out my own side voice. In regards to the Delta fix, Governor Brown did all the environmental double twin tunnels. Gavin Newsom comes in, goes to one tunnel. What assurances do we have, or do you have, that it will ever be done, and how long is it going to take to do it again?
Honestly, I can provide no assurances.
I want to guarantee.
I have not been sitting on the water fix hearings that have been happening for the last, I think, 3 years now. If you can spare a thought for the attorneys who have been sitting on all those and been paying attention and getting ready to make the decisions they need to make, only to find out that they're going to have to probably do it all again, please do so. It's not hard to see how moving massive amounts of water from the north to the south can be beneficial from a water supply perspective. There's a lot of local opposition. I don't know how strong it will remain in the future. I don't know if there's any outreach that can be done that will maybe make some of that local opposition go away. And when I say local, I mean Delta residents and farmers. I do think that the ability to exercise some sort of control over the water supplies of the state is what has made the state an economic powerhouse, but I really can't say where the water fix project will go from here.
So you're going to have to come back next year. Carlos having like a 40-year run, just giving you updates on that. All right, so we're going to end. I just thank the panel. They came in. So I'm told that we're going to move on to the next breakout. We've got about 5 minutes. I think the safe and affordable drinking water is going to be here. Roman, is that right?
I don't have my program in front of me, I'm sorry.
Okay, so safe and affordable drinking water is one of them. Capturing the next generation of water and builder professionals is the other one. Can somebody tell me what's on the
Builder professionals should be here. The future builders.
The future safe and affordable drinking water?
It's going to be next door. The builder professionals will be
okay,
here. Capturing the next generation of builder professionals.
The next generation is going to be here. The other one's going to be next